I thought we had the kind of life that most people envy. You know, the comfortable partnership built over years, where you don't need to second-guess each other's every move or worry about drifting apart. We had our rituals: Saturday morning coffee, evening walks, the occasional quiet weekend trip. For over a decade, this life was my anchor. I'm not saying we were perfect, but I had always thought we were solid. Until recently, I never questioned that. One morning, that foundation shattered. I woke up early for a work trip, hoping to catch a bit of sunlight before heading out. I remember glancing at my wife's phone charging on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a text notification. A message from my own father. "Last night was unforgettable. I love you." At first, I was in disbelief. I read the message 3 times, willing it to somehow change. I tried to convince myself it had to be a joke or some kind of innocent misunderstanding. I never thought the words "last night was unforgettable" would throw me into a storm, but that message was my invitation to a nightmare. After she stirred awake, I went straight to her, my voice breaking. "What's going on with you and my father?" I demanded, watching her face for any sign that this was all a big mistake. She stared at me, her eyes wide, caught between fear and shame. For a second, I thought maybe she'd deny it. But instead, she let out a trembling sigh and sank onto the edge of the bed. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she whispered, looking down at her hands as if they held the answers to everything. Her words sliced right through me. This way. As if there had been a better way to admit she'd betrayed me with my own father. In that moment, I wanted to shout, to break something, to turn back time. But the only thing I managed to do was sit there, numb, as she began to speak. She admitted that it had started about a year ago. "It was never supposed to go this far," she said, voice choked with emotion. She tried to explain that she had felt distant, lonely, and that somehow, my father, a man I had trusted and looked up to my entire life, had been there to comfort her. Every word felt like a hammer striking a different piece of the life we'd built together. I could barely process it, the betrayal hitting me from 2 sides at once. My own father, my wife, the 2 people I thought I knew best in this world. Why him? Why my father, of all people? I managed to choke out. "I don't know. It just happened," she whispered, her face streaked with tears. But I could see something else in her expression: relief, almost as if the burden of hiding this dark secret had finally been lifted. But for me, that was only the beginning of the burden, a weight so heavy it threatened to suffocate me right there in our own bedroom. I was so close to walking out that morning, leaving everything behind, but something stopped me. Anger, hurt, and a rising storm inside me. I was not going to walk away without making her, and him, feel the same level of betrayal. If this was a game they were playing, then I would make sure we were all in it. I could barely hear anything over the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. She kept talking, her words muddled together in a broken mix of apologies and excuses, each one clawing at my patience, daring me to stay calm. I wanted her to explain how my own father had become the man she turned to instead of me. But every answer she gave felt like a slap in the face, like watching our past dissolve into lies right before my eyes. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice low, trying to keep from exploding. She nodded, but there was a distance in her eyes that I couldn't read. A hint of regret, but also something colder. This was a woman I thought I knew better than anyone, yet in this moment, I felt like I was standing in front of a stranger. "It wasn't meant to hurt you," she whispered, staring at the floor, her voice barely above a murmur. "Not meant to hurt me?" I scoffed, incredulous. What else could this possibly do? There was silence, thick and uncomfortable. I glanced at her, trying to see something real in her expression, something that would tell me this was all some terrible mistake. But she only looked at me with that same defeated, distant look, and suddenly, I realized something chilling. She wasn't fighting for us. She wasn't even really sorry in the way I thought she should be. She was sorry she'd been caught. I don't know how long we sat there in that stifling silence, both of us lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. But then something darker began to take root in me. Why should she get away with this? Why should she and my father walk around, living their lives as if what they'd done was nothing more than a mistake. If they had no problem crossing the line, why should I play fair either? The idea took shape in my mind almost instantly, and it was surprisingly liberating. My hands were shaking, but this time, not from the pain of betrayal. It was something else, something that tasted a little like justice and a lot like revenge. If she could cheat with my father, then maybe I'd find comfort elsewhere, too. I thought of her mother, a quiet, composed woman, beautiful in an understated way. We'd always been friendly, but I had always kept things respectful, of course. But now? Now respect felt like a luxury for people who hadn't been gutted from the inside out. I couldn't believe I was even considering it, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Why should I be the only one suffering in this disaster? But for now, I kept the plan to myself. I wanted it to fester, to grow until it was more than just an idea. This wasn't only about getting even. It was about taking back control of my own life. If they thought they could rewrite our story, I'd make sure they both knew I could write it, too, and maybe in ways they'd never expect. The idea of revenge clung to me like a second skin. For days after her confession, I felt myself pulled under by it, suffocating in my anger and betrayal. Each night, I lay awake in the dark, rethinking everything I thought I knew, wondering if any of it had ever been real. The trust we'd built, the promises we'd made. It all seemed like smoke, impossible to hold on to. I knew I couldn't change what had happened, but if I was going to live with this, then they would, too. A week after finding out, I was finally ready to take the next step. Her mother had always been gracious to me, treating me like her own son since the day I married her daughter. I knew this was a twisted plan, but I also knew that, in a way, it was perfect. She was everything my father wasn't: dependable, kind, and steady. If I was going to do this, it wasn't only to balance the scales. It was to remind myself that there was more to me than the shell they had left behind. I started small, reaching out to her mother under the pretense of needing support. When we spoke, I could feel the hesitation in her voice, sensing something was wrong but not pressing me to reveal it. I told her we'd been going through a rough patch, that I was struggling and just needed someone to talk to. She listened, genuinely concerned, and without fail, her kindness made me question whether I could actually go through with this. But the thought of my wife with my father kept me on track. If they could burn our family's foundation to the ground, then I'd use those same embers to build something new. Soon, it became routine. Every other day, I'd send a message or call, keeping our conversations light at first, letting her in on small details of my life. She grew comfortable enough to respond with little stories of her own, and slowly, it turned into something more. I could hear the gentle familiarity in her voice, a soft comfort that, to my surprise, felt real. She'd ask me if I was eating enough, if I'd found time for myself amidst the stress, and the more we spoke, the more I felt a pull toward her. Maybe it was just the loneliness talking. Maybe it was the perfect irony of it all, but I couldn't stop. One day, we met for coffee. The moment was laced with a thrill I hadn't expected, and the way she smiled when she saw me told me that she sensed it too. We talked about life, about everything except my wife and her betrayal. It was a relief to escape, even for a moment, into a world where things felt uncomplicated. The idea of turning this meeting into something more hung between us like unspoken words, and as we said our goodbyes, I saw the hint of something in her eyes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was loneliness, too. But as I walked away, I knew one thing. I was one step closer to getting even. After that coffee, something shifted inside me. The thrill of revenge didn't feel so much like anger anymore. It was something else, a strange mix of freedom and power, like I had control again, even if in a way that most people wouldn't understand. For years, I'd been the steady one, the predictable husband. Now, I was rewriting the rules, taking a path I never thought I'd walk. My wife was still living in our house, moving through our days like a ghost. We had barely spoken since her confession, each of us avoiding the other, finding excuses to leave the room when one of us walked in. But I couldn't leave, at least, not yet. She didn't know it, but I was holding the cards now, and every day under that same roof made me more resolute. One evening, my wife asked me to sit down with her. Her voice was low and cautious, almost as if she was afraid to disturb the fragile silence we built between us. "I know things are tense right now," she began, twisting her hands in her lap, "but maybe we should try to talk this out? For us. For the years we've spent together." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. For us? Now she wanted to talk about us. After I'd uncovered the ugliest truth imaginable? Still, I stayed quiet, watching her closely, wondering if she really believed that a conversation could fix the damage she and my father had done. "What do you think there is left to say?" I finally replied, my voice calm but cold. She looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "I made a mistake. A terrible one. I know that doesn't make it better, but I want to try and rebuild. To fix things." Her words sounded practiced, like she'd been rehearsing them, hoping that if she said the right things, it would somehow erase the reality of what she'd done. I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Do you even know what you're asking?" I said, a hint of bitterness slipping through. "You want to pretend that we can just pick up the pieces and go back to the way things were? Because I can't. Not after this." The room fell into silence again, the weight of our broken marriage pressing down on us both. I could see her struggle, her desperate attempt to find a sliver of hope between us, but the look in my eyes must have told her there was none. Not now, maybe not ever. She didn't know about the hours I'd spent with her mother, about the revenge I was carefully putting into motion. At that moment, I decided to escalate things further. I wanted her to feel every ounce of betrayal I'd felt. "I think we both need space," I said. "Time to figure out what we really want." Her face fell, but she nodded. "Maybe that's for the best," she whispered, her voice cracking. Inwardly, I steeled myself, knowing that space was just my way of buying time to finish what I'd started. Every time she looked at me with that regret in her eyes, it only fueled my resolve. If she wanted to rebuild, she would have to do it alone. I had other plans, and if this was the game she wanted to play, I would make sure I finished it in a way she would never forget as the days passed. My wife and I drifted further apart, speaking only when necessary. Our conversations reduced to small talk about bills and groceries. But beneath the mundane routine, there was an undercurrent of tension, like we both knew something was about to give. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at me too long, as though my presence alone was a reminder of her betrayal. Part of me took satisfaction in that, but another part of me felt hollow, knowing we were clinging to a ghost of what once was. Meanwhile, my relationship with her mother deepened. We started meeting more frequently, always under the guise of checking in or getting some air. Sometimes we'd have coffee. Other times, we'd take long walks through the park. Each meeting felt like slipping further into a place I knew I shouldn't go but didn't want to leave. I wasn't blind to what I was doing. I knew that each step I took, each small boundary I crossed, was a part of the plan, but it was also comforting. It felt real in a way that nothing had for months. One afternoon, we met at a secluded cafe just out of town. As we sat across from each other, her eyes caught mine, warm and filled with understanding. She could tell I was carrying a weight on my shoulders, and for a moment, I forgot that this was my wife's mother sitting across from me. I only saw someone who cared, someone who wanted to help ease the burden. "You look lost," she said gently, reaching out and placing a hand on mine. The touch was soft, comforting, but it sparked something in me, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this twisted journey. Her hand lingered, her thumb brushing over my knuckles, and in that moment, I let my guard down. "Maybe I am," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been holding on to anger, to betrayal. I don't know who I am anymore." She looked at me with sympathy, her own eyes shining with something unspoken. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said, her voice full of warmth. The look on her face was so genuine that, for a moment, I felt the desire to forget everything, to just be here with her, to let the moment stretch on forever. Without thinking, I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. The moment was electric, every nerve in my body alive with anticipation, and before I knew it, our lips met. It was a soft, tentative kiss, one that I could have easily pulled away from, but I didn't. We both leaned into it, letting ourselves sink into something we both knew we shouldn't feel. When we finally broke apart, there was a stunned silence between us, both of us realizing we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her face flushed, and she looked away, biting her lip. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice barely steady, but I shook my head. "No," I replied, with a calmness that surprised even me. "This isn't on you. If anything, it feels like the most honest thing I've done in a long time." She hesitated, her fingers still intertwined with mine. "What are we doing?" I didn't have an answer, not one I could give without admitting the darkness that had grown inside me since discovering the affair. I only knew that this felt like a strange form of justice. If my wife and my father had thrown away our trust so easily, then maybe they deserved to feel what it was like to have someone cross the lines they'd drawn. We parted ways that day with a promise, one we both understood without saying a word. I had officially crossed the line, but as I walked away, I felt more alive than I had in months, and there was no going back now. From that moment on, everything felt different. I was a man living two lives, slipping between anger and the satisfaction of having something of my own. I'd go through the motions at home, playing the part of the betrayed husband, barely glancing at my wife as she shuffled around, haunted by the choice she'd made. But outside the walls of our house, I had something that was mine, a connection, a spark, a secret that felt almost sacred. My wife's mother and I continued meeting, though now with a new, dangerous energy between us. Our check-ins became something more, something unspoken but powerful, like we both understood this was no longer about comfort. Each time I looked at her, I saw a mirror of my own loneliness and betrayal, the pain she felt for me, and, in some strange way, the pain of her own daughter's choices bound us together in ways I never thought possible. One night, I drove over to her place. She greeted me at the door with a look of uncertainty and something more, a pull neither of us could resist. We didn't even speak. There was no need to. I stepped inside, and in the quiet that followed, we both crossed that invisible line once again. The connection felt intense, raw, and consuming. The tangled emotions that had plagued me, the anger, the betrayal, the feeling of being unworthy, seemed to dissolve as we held each other. I didn't have to think about my wife or my father, didn't have to wonder how I'd been blindsided so badly. With her, I felt a kind of twisted redemption, a reprieve from the constant reminders of my broken marriage. But it wasn't long before the reality of what I was doing seeped back in. As I lay awake beside her that night, the weight of our actions settled heavily on my chest. The silence between us was different this time, heavy with guilt, but also with the unmistakable feeling that we were both in too deep to turn back. She turned to me, her eyes searching, almost pleading, as if looking for a way out of the mess we'd created. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer, but I knew that pulling back now would be impossible. "Let's just take it one day at a time," I murmured, knowing full well that neither of us was in control anymore. We were riding a wave of raw emotion, and deep down, I knew it was bound to crash. But for now, it didn't matter. The next morning, as I walked through my front door, the familiar feeling of dread washed over me. My wife was in the kitchen, making breakfast, her expression guarded as she watched me come in. There was a tense silence between us, both of us keenly aware of the distance that had grown. I wondered if she could see it in my eyes, if she could sense that I was no longer the same man she'd betrayed. Part of me almost hoped she would, that she'd know exactly where I'd been and who I'd been with. But she said nothing, just lowered her gaze and turned back to the stove. And in that quiet moment, I felt a rush of power, a satisfaction in knowing I had my own secret now. I had thought that revenge would make me feel hollow, would somehow drag me down to her level. But instead, I felt in control. For the first time since everything had unraveled, I was the one holding the cards, the one calling the shots. With every passing day, it became clearer. I was no longer the man she thought she could manipulate or deceive. I was becoming something else, someone who had no room for forgiveness, who could keep secrets just as well as she had. And if she ever found out? Part of me relished the thought, knowing that the shock and pain on her face would be just the beginning of the payback she'd earned. The days rolled by, each one blending into the next as my affair with my wife's mother continued, hidden in the shadows of my broken marriage. Every time we met, it felt as though I was reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. But the closer I got to her, the more the lines blurred, and revenge started to feel less like an end goal and more like a spiral I couldn't pull myself out of. One evening, I came home to find my wife sitting at the table, looking as though she'd been crying. She gestured to the seat across from her, her face drawn and tired. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely audible. For a second, my heart raced. Did she know? Had she somehow found out? I sat down, trying to keep my expression neutral, to guard the secret that was becoming harder to hide. "I can't keep living like this," she began, her voice cracking. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I want to try to fix things, if you'll let me." There was a desperation in her voice, a rawness I hadn't heard in months, and for the first time, I saw how my silence, my anger, had eaten away at her too. But even as she spoke, I couldn't let go of the betrayal. The image of her and my father flashed through my mind, and any sympathy I might have felt vanished. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix," I replied coldly. "You made your choices. You and him." I watched her flinch, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to take mine, but I pulled back, standing up. "You're sorry now, but you weren't sorry then," I said, turning away. The anger I had been carrying flared up, and I didn't care if she saw the bitterness in my eyes. She looked devastated, but I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. She had tried to break me, but here I was, unbroken and stronger than ever, because now I had something she could never touch. The more time I spent with her mother, the deeper our connection grew. It was strange and surreal, but there was a part of me that found comfort in her, in the fact that she knew all of me, the hurt, the betrayal, the anger. One night, she looked at me with a sad smile and said, "I don't want to keep sneaking around." I knew what she meant. She was ready to end this hidden affair, ready to face the consequences. And I realized in that moment that I was too. So, I invited my wife to meet me for dinner. She arrived looking hopeful, maybe even thinking this was some step toward reconciliation. But as soon as we sat down, I told her everything. Her eyes widened as the realization sank in, the color draining from her face. She looked at me, horrified and broken. "How could you, with my mother?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, unfazed. "How could you, with my father?" I shot back. Her silence was answer enough. After the revelation, our home turned into a battleground. My wife's shock quickly morphed into rage, her voice echoing through the house as she hurled accusations, insults, and all the venom she could muster. She betrayed me first, yet here she was, acting as though my actions were somehow worse. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" she screamed, her voice filled with a fury I'd never seen before. But I stayed calm, meeting her rage with a cold indifference. "I'm only giving you a taste of what you served me," I replied, watching as the words hit her like a punch to the gut. The look in her eyes changed then, a realization settling in. She knew there was no way to turn back, no chance to undo the damage in the days that followed. My wife cut off all contact with her mother, refusing to acknowledge her existence. But her mother wasn't deterred. She came to me, her face lined with worry, regret, and an unexpected resolve. "I can't go back to pretending," she said quietly. "It's time I tell her everything." I watched her walk into the house, her steps hesitant but determined. She sat across from her daughter, and I heard the words spill out, heard her voice crack as she tried to explain. My wife's screams were deafening, her words venomous and harsh, but her mother didn't back down. When she finally stormed out, the silence that filled the house was thick with unspoken truths and shattered illusions. We were no longer just a family broken by betrayal. We were ruins, left to pick through what remained as the fallout settled. The house felt emptier than ever. My wife and I barely spoke, and her mother and I kept our distance, each of us bearing the scars of our actions. Slowly, we began dividing our lives, separating our finances, preparing for the inevitable. One night, I found myself sitting alone, staring at the remnants of a life I had spent years building. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a hollow emptiness, the weight of consequences finally settling in. The day the divorce papers arrived, there was no ceremony, no final confrontation. My wife signed them without a word, her face set in a mask of determination. She didn't look at me as she handed them over, didn't flinch as I took them and signed away the last remnants of our marriage. With the divorce finalized, I watched her walk away, a stranger now, someone I had once loved but barely recognized. Before the divorce was final, I made sure every legal avenue was on my side. I took my time with the settlement, using every clause to protect what was mine. In the end, I walked away with nearly everything: our savings, the house, and the assets we built together. She was left with almost nothing, forced to start from scratch. There was no triumph in it, just a sense of closure. She had betrayed me, and now she would live with the consequences. Months passed, the scars slowly healing, leaving only faint reminders of the chaos and destruction. I kept in touch with her mother, though we both knew that whatever we had wasn't built to last. We'd come together in the storm, but as life began to settle, we drifted apart, each of us finding our own path forward. Looking back, I saw the wreckage for what it was, a painful chapter in a life that would go on. There was no forgiveness, no reconciliation, just the quiet understanding that sometimes life breaks us in ways we don't expect, and sometimes we rebuild alone. I walked away from it all, a little wiser, a little colder, but stronger. There was a freedom in the aftermath, a sense of finally stepping into a life I could call my own. And with that, I moved forward, ready to start again.